Okay, now let's talk about a process model that is well known as a process model. Although, as we're going to see, even that statement may be somewhat debatable. This is the spiral model as described by Pressman. This model has an evolutionary process flow because it evolves the software through multiple iterations that include each of the framework activities: communication, planning, modeling, construction, and deployment. Regarding this model, Pressman does mention that it's a risk-driven model, meaning that risk assessment is built in to the model. He also mentions that anchor point milestones are an important part of the model. These are work products and conditions that are typically related to risk assessment. However, the model that Pressman gives here is way oversimplified and may even be a bit misleading. This is the description of the spiral model as depicted by Barry Boehm, the person who developed the spiral model. Let's look at the differences between this version of the spiral model and the spiral model that we saw in the last slide. In this version of the spiral model, we start with a concept of the requirements, and then we get a concept of the operation of the system. And then we develop a requirements plan. Once we have a plan for gathering the requirements, we assess risk. Notice that we stop to identify and resolve risks in every iteration of the spiral model. So just what is involved in identifying and resolving risks? In identifying risks, you're trying to figure out what your problems are and how much time, effort, and money it's going to take to resolve those problems. If I asked you what you thought was the biggest risk in developing a piece of software, what would you tell me? In fact, go ahead and take a minute to pause the video and think about this question. Okay, there are a lot of potential answers here. Changing requirements, lack of money, inability to meet deadlines, but they all essentially lead to the same overreaching risk, and that is the risk of failure. The risk that you dedicate all this time and effort and money to a project, and the project fails. And this is a very real risk. There have been very high-profile examples of project failures. One classic case is the Denver Airport baggage handling system. This system was going to be the most advanced baggage handling system in the world, but due in part to underestimating the complexity of the software, the system was delayed for over a year, costing the airport an extra $500 million. And the system they ended up with was just a shadow of the one they had envisioned. In the video gaming world, a video game called Duke Nukem Forever became synonymous with the term vaporware because it was so hyped by the company that was producing it. But then a year went by and no game. Then 2 years, then 3, then 4. Eventually, people gave up on it. By the time a game with that title came out 13 years later, the gaming world had moved on. A more recent example is the disastrous rollout of the Obamacare website, healthcare.gov. When the system became overloaded with users, it ground to a halt. In the press, it was seen as a political disaster, but it was really a software disaster with serious political consequences. So the risk of software failure is very real. And because the risk of software failure is real, it's important to try to deal with that risk. The way you deal with it in the spiral model is that in each iteration, once you've identified your risk, you go and talk to the stakeholders about those risks. If the stakeholders, who are customers, clients, users, developers, and anyone else who has a stake in the success of the project, if the stakeholders are no longer on board once they understand the risks, then you stop the project. When I was working in industry, there was this notion that you should innovate, take risks, and fail fast. Now, that obviously doesn't mean that you should try to fail. It means that if a project is going to fail, it's better to find out sooner than later. Okay, back to the model. Once you've identified your risks, you can build a prototype to examine those risks in more detail. So the first iteration might be looking at the requirements. The second iteration might be looking at the development plan. And the third iteration might be looking at the test plan. All of them potentially ending in a prototype to help clarify potential problems. In this diagram, the third iteration ends with an operational prototype, which is more or less synonymous with an evolutionary prototype, in that it's something you're not going to throw away. And the fourth iteration is where the software is developed and released. You can also imagine keeping the spiral going and releasing more and more functionality in subsequent operations. In my description of this diagram, I've used terms like might and potentially. And that's because there's a danger in taking this diagram too literally here. In fact, Barry Boehm likes to talk about the spiral model as guiding a team to adopt elements of one or more other models, like the waterfall, the incremental, or evolutionary prototyping. This guidance is based on the risk patterns of a particular project. Finally, here are some misconceptions that Barry Boehm claims that people have about the spiral model. The first misconception can be directly leveled at Pressman. In Pressman's version of the spiral model, it really is just a sequence of waterfall increments. Conversely, some folks might think that one activity corresponds to one iteration of the spiral, which is certainly not true. And finally, as we've already said, it's a mistake to think that you have to follow the sequence of activities in the diagram. In the end, it's important to know that the spiral model is evolutionary or iterative, and that identifying and managing risk is a big part of the model. Before we leave the spiral model completely, I wanted to show you this example of a risk exposure curve. This one is looking at two kinds of risk exposure. The first is risk exposure due to bugs or problems with the software. That's the green curve. And the second is risk exposure due to competition and market forces. That's the purple curve. The idea is that if you release your software too early, then you run the risk of people rejecting your product because it's so buggy. On the other hand, if you release your software too late, then you run the risk that people have already adopted your competitor's product. The blue curve, total risk exposure, is simply the sum of the green and the purple curves. Assuming that these risks are the only one that go into total risk exposure, there's going to be some sweet spot in the middle where the total risk, though still present, is minimized.